Our next speaker is Christopher Kiekintveld. He's from the University of Texas, El Paso, and he'll be talking to us about game theoretical analysis.
Thank you so much. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's really exciting to be here. It's really exciting to see so many people here that are interested in this interdisciplinary area between computer science and psychology. So I come from the computer science side of the fence, and particularly my expertise and background is in artificial intelligence. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about a line of work that I've been pursuing with some of the collaborators who are listed here on this slide. And we've been thinking about applications of a particular technique we use in artificial intelligence for decision making called computational game theory. And in AI, sometimes people think that we are only interested in trying to replicate one of you, right? So trying to replace you. And that's not true. So we're interested in designing intelligent agents that can perform all kinds of tasks, including tasks that humans may be terrible at. We're also interested in designing decision support kinds of systems where humans and intelligent agents are working together to make decisions or providing useful recommendations and so forth. So there's a large number of research challenges that we've been dealing with in our work, including dealing with uncertainty, designing scalable algorithms, and this third one is the one that I'm going to focus on mostly today, which is thinking about human agents and how our artificial agents can reason about humans and interact with them effectively. So today what I want to do is start out talking a little bit about some background in security games from where we started out, which is actually thinking about securing physical infrastructure, and how we've been able to extend those games and improve them using behavioral models. Then I'll talk a little bit about some work that we've done in the context of cybersecurity using game theoretic modeling. And finally, the latest line of work that we've started very recently is thinking about how we can use psychology and ideas and data that we have from psychology to improve game theory for cybersecurity games. Okay, so to begin with, going back quite a few years ago now, we've been thinking about how to use game theory to make decisions about security policies in the context of physical infrastructure protection across a number of different kinds of domains. And a lot of these problems boil down to, in essence, a resource allocation kind of problem where you have a small number of resources, whether they are police officers to try to secure a physical location, federal air marshals trying to provide security for airline flights, Coast Guard vehicle or vessels that are trying to patrol coastal areas and so forth. And you have to schedule them and assign them to patrolling kinds of activities or other activities to improve security. And one of the interesting things is that you have an adversary, right? You have somebody who is trying to observe your security policy, learn about that policy, and then plan an attack in response to that. So where we have applied game theory is to think about how do you make these resource allocation decisions in a way that is unpredictable and hard for an adversary to learn about and exploit. And so there's a dual decision problem going on. There's the decision for the security forces of how do they make the resource allocation, and then the attacker is making a decision that interacts with that. Okay. So for those of you who may not be familiar at all with game theory, I'm going to give you a very simple example that captures some of the essence of what we're talking about. So this is a very simple two-player game, and we have two players, a defender and an attacker. And in this game, we have two generic targets. Okay? And our defender has one resource that he can deploy to protect one of these two targets. Okay? Just to make a decision about where to allocate the resource. And then the attacker gets to attack one of these two targets. And the numbers here, this is a utility function, but the meaning here is to try to reflect something about the goals and desires of the two players and how positively or negatively they view different situations. So in this upper left cell here, we have a 1 here, which represents that the defender in this case has protected target 1, and target 1 was the one that the attacker chose. So the defender views that somewhat positively, while the attacker views that somewhat negatively, and so forth. So we could represent a lot of different things using these kinds of models. And now we can think about what decisions are best for the players, right? The tricky thing is that the decisions interact. So of course, if the defender has chosen to protect target 1, the attacker would prefer to attack the undefended target, target 2, and vice versa, right? So the two decisions inherently interact. And that's what game theoretic models allow us to capture as these interacting decisions, and then start reasoning about how those decisions might be made.
On your previous slide, so are
Yes.
you assuming then that the attacker can perceive whether or not the target is defended?
So
Or is that part of the game where you're going to...
So many different things can be modeled. It's different kinds of games. So you can get very complicated in terms of how you model what they observe and what they don't. So I was going to go on to the next slide. So, not sure what happened to our clicker. And we seem to be stalled. Okay. Yeah, so this is one of the most common ways, at least in physical infrastructure protection, of modeling this. There are other more complicated models. But here, basically, we assume that there's a repeated surveillance phase where the attacker can sort of observe what's going on in your policy and learn what is the distribution. How likely are you to protect each of these different targets in your policies? So this is modeled in the game as the defender committing to a mixed strategy, which is a randomized policy. The attacker observes that exactly and then chooses an optimal response. So here, there's inherently part of the model where we are basically doing sort of theory of mind, right? And in a standard game theoretic model, one of the most common assumptions is to assume a perfectly rational opponent. So somebody who is at the extreme of this rational choice idea where they are observing everything and making perfectly utility maximizing choices. Okay. So one of the interesting things about these security game models is that they are modeling secrecy and deception. So these are things that have been part of thinking about warfare and conflict since the beginning of warfare and conflict, right? We have many examples of information manipulation. I've got the Trojan horse here. We've got ghost tank divisions here. But the question is, how do you use that strategically? What is the right way to use deception? What is the optimal way to try to confuse an adversary? And this is the kind of thing that game theoretic models allow us to at least pose as a question and reason about. Okay. So we have a framework for thinking about these kinds of questions, but now we come to the part where we're interested in bringing in the human aspect, right? So I mentioned that a lot of standard game theoretic models make an assumption that you have a perfectly rational opponent. And they do that in part because it's easy in some sense. So we know we can define very easily what a perfectly rational player is going to do. It's much harder to talk about all of the things that a partially rational or less rational player might do. What kind of mistakes might they make in their reasoning, right? And this is really where we're hoping to gain further insight from psychology and from all of the work on human factors is moving away from this assumption of perfect rationality and being able to take into account things like maybe prospect theory or anchoring biases or all the other things that have been brought up in earlier talks today and that we could find in the literature. So there's a very rich and diverse set of these things that we might try to incorporate. So based on the work that we've been doing in physical infrastructure protection, we've actually started probably 6 or 7 years ago a line of work looking at evaluating security games against human opponents in laboratory settings, as well as a few fielded experiments. And this is an example of an early game model that was played against human participants on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And it's actually designed to reflect one of the early applications of security games, which was to the Los Angeles International Airport, and deciding where you put K9 units to protect different terminals in the airport. So these 8 choices that the player has basically are designed to reflect the 8 terminals at the airport. And there are different rewards, different magnitudes of benefits for the attacker if they successfully attack one of these different terminals. There are penalties if they are caught trying to attack one of these terminals. There are probabilities that they get to see about how likely these terminals are to be defended, and so forth. So this is a decision problem, and we can see how people actually make these decisions, right? And our inherent goal in running these kinds of experiments is to test out things like game theory versus maybe a human scheduler who's trying to schedule the security guards versus a refined game model that actually takes into account a human model or a more human-like model of an attacker that's not necessarily perfectly rational. So let me give you just one simple example. There have been many of these that have been studied. This is one of the first ones that we looked at, what we call a quantal response equilibrium. It actually goes back to simple choice theory kinds of models where people observed that, well, if you give people even simple binary choices, they don't always choose the best one according to some sort of expected utility maximization, but they do tend to choose better alternatives more often. And perhaps a simple way to model that is using something like this little mathematical formula here, which basically says that you are more likely to choose better options than worse options. So this has been integrated into a particular game theoretic solution concept called the quantal response equilibrium, which includes this assumption that players are going to choose not always the best choice in a particular kind of way. And we run experiments with these sorts of models. So this shows you one example of the data, but I'm going to focus actually on the table down here that sort of characterizes the overall kinds of results that we see. Okay? And so these 3 columns are what we would see if a human scheduled the security policy, what we would see with the game theory model with a perfect attacker model, and game theory model that accounts for some human aspects of the attacker. And here we have actual human attackers, and here we have the mathematically perfect attackers. And what we tend to see in these experiments, broadly speaking, is that humans are not very good at scheduling against either mathematically optimal opponents or other humans. One difficulty that they have actually is trying to randomize effectively. Humans tend to fall into patterns over time. They have a hard time figuring out exactly what kind of probabilities they should use for these sorts of things. So it turns out to be actually quite a difficult problem as the defender in these situations for humans to solve. So game theory with a perfect attacker model does better than humans against human attackers, but not as good as these kinds of models that actually look at taking into account different psychological biases and so forth. So we can improve on the perfectly rational models by incorporating that kind of information against human attackers. Now, if we look at against perfect attackers, so the game theoretic solutions are theoretically optimal. There's no way to improve on them, assuming that we have modeled the game correctly, which is a whole other set of issues. However, I would note that the human attacker models only do okay against the perfect attackers. So there's actually one red flag and one thing that we need to be a bit careful about when we start optimizing against particular human weaknesses in decision making is that actually potentially opens us up to exploitation. So I can try then to make you believe that I have some weakness, right? So we see this in, for example, poker players, right? Where you try to teach somebody that you have a weakness and then only later to try to exploit that. So there are some subtleties that we have to be careful about here. Okay, so that's kind of a proof of concept and some things that we've been working on to try to improve game theoretic modeling using human behavior. So now I want to talk a little bit more directly about a more cybersecurity context for these games. We've looked at a number of different cybersecurity kinds of decision problems. I'm going to focus on one that relates to using honeypots. So for those of you who may not be aware of what a honeypot is, there are many different kinds of honeypots, but the basic concept is that you include some sort of fake host or service or account, perhaps, in your network or in your system as a decoy to try to attract an attacker. That can be for a number of different purposes. That can serve as a kind of intrusion detection. No real user should be interacting with the systems. That may tell us that some adversary is present. It can be to collect instances of malware, collect more detailed information about the types of behaviors attackers are using, and so forth. But the challenge is that designing and deploying believable, high-quality honeypots is actually quite difficult and quite expensive. So this work is not so much about that particular challenge of how do we make them believable. There's definitely a lot of interesting work to do there, and a lot has been done. But we want to think about how to use these in a sort of game model where we have a limited number of honeypot resources to deploy, kind of similar to our physical security games. And we want to know what is the best way to deploy these honeypots. So in particular, a very simple version of this game is one in which we have two players, an attacker and a defender. The defender, you can think of as maybe the network administrator, and they know the structure of their network. And the decision that they're going to make is they're going to deploy a specific number of honeypots into the system, and they have to decide how enticing they're going to make them. So attackers are going to look at the system and say, these look like particularly attractive targets, and the defender here gets to choose how attractive to make these honeypots. Okay? And perhaps your first impulse is, well, let's just make them as attractive as possible. Okay? So maybe we will, pull out an old unpatched version of Windows 95 and make it look like a database server that's storing all of our credit cards. Now, if you're an attacker, is that the machine in the network that you're actually going to attack? Probably not, because you're onto the game, right? It's suspicious. Okay, so this is actually getting at one aspect of whether something is believable or not. Is it too good to be true? Okay, and that's kind of the essence of what this game gets at. So the defender makes a decision to deploy honeypots with particular values. The attacker then observes the network after it's been modified and makes a choice about which things to attack. And the payoffs reflect positive scores for the attacker if they choose a real host, and negative score if they choose a honeypot, and vice versa. So this is just a diagram of what the defender's view of the network is. So we've abstracted here, and these different hosts have different importance values, essentially. And the question they're asking is, how valuable machine are we going to add? And then something gets added to the network by the defender. The defender then does perhaps some sort of scan of the network to see basically what's out here and think about launching a more targeted attack, and has to decide which of these machines to attack. This is a fairly simple game. We've looked at more complex variations of this. I'll talk a little bit about some of the extensions. But the point is that we have, even within this simple context, some interesting decisions for attackers and defenders. And this just shows the progress of the game. So we have a nature player that generates the real network. The defender adds the honeypots, and then the attacker makes a choice to attack. Mentioned that we can make this more interesting in a lot of ways. So one is by adding probing actions. So one of the things a network security person will say immediately is, well, there's a lot of ways to think about gathering more information to determine whether something is a honeypot or not. Maybe I can do traffic analysis or something to see if anybody's actually interacting with this machine, and so forth. So we can add things like probing actions to capture some of those kinds of scenarios. So this is the slide where I point out that as a computer scientist, a lot of my talk and a lot of the interesting questions would really be about the algorithmic challenges of how to solve these games and why they're hard to solve, why coming up with optimal solutions is a really interesting problem. We've got lots of papers about this problem, but I'll just point out that it's hard and interesting and spare you the details for the purposes of today. So this is an example of a simulation result that just demonstrates that these models are doing something non-trivial. So first, let's just look at the data up here. So we've got the defender's loss, and of course the defender would like to minimize losses as much as possible. And this is adding a different number of honeypots into the game. using different kinds of solutions. So here is the equilibrium game-theoretic optimal solution. We're evaluating all of these against an optimal attacker in this particular set. Here's that sort of naive idea of, well, let's just make everything look as valuable as possible. So we'll add only the maximum possible value. Here's another naive method of just, well, we'll choose arbitrarily. We'll use a random decision. And fortunately, what we see is that the game-theoretic solutions do much better than either of the naive baselines against optimal worst-case attackers, and we're able to do much better. The character of these solutions is similar to what I talked about in the patrolling games, where we actually randomize the selection of honeypots. So we place more valuable honeypots into the network in general, but we have to mix in some less valuable honeypots so that it's not so obvious which ones are the honeypots and which ones are not, essentially. Any means Nash equilibrium, so that is we've solved the game model for a Nash equilibrium solution against a perfectly rational player. Maximum means that we, in this case, the values go up to 4, so we only add honeypots with a value of 4. And random means, in this case, there's honeypots or machines that have a value of 1, 2, 3, or 4, so we just choose 25% 1, 25% 2, 25% 3, 25% 4. Okay. So again, we can make these games a lot more interesting in different ways. I'm going to give you one more quick example of that. This is something that we call an attack graph. If you are into cybersecurity, you may have encountered attack graphs before. We're not the first to have looked at these attack graphs, but basically they represent more complex sequential attack plans where you may have to have an attacker who takes multiple different kinds of actions, and there are certain actions that you can only take once you've achieved certain conditions, and so forth. They're a very powerful way of representing the planning problem that an attacker has. One of the interesting things about attack graphs is that there are tools that have been developed and people are actively researching how do you generate these kinds of attacker planning problems from doing, for example, scans of your network. So you can use automated tools to try to scan your network and gather information about it, cross-reference that against information about known vulnerabilities and known types of attacks, and so forth, and you can use that to construct these sorts of attack graphs. So again, we can construct game-theoretic models where we actually look at different kinds of defender hardening actions, such as adding honeypots into a network, and then we're looking at how that changes the attacker's optimal planning problem in response. So when we've made modifications to our network, how does that change what an attacker can do to us, essentially?
And are you trying to do that in a defensive mode? I mean, you're trying to simulate what attackers' course of actions might be so you can decide how to better do that.
Right. So if I make, let's say I have, in general it's much more, but let's say I have 3 different options for how I'm going to try to mitigate an attack. I try those 3 different things, essentially. I look at those different options here. And then I look at, well, if I do that, what would an optimal attacker do to attack me, given each of those options? And then I can choose the one that gives me the most bang for my buck, in a sense. Okay. So again, this is just examples of the kinds of ways that we can formulate these problems. So now I want to end with a quick discussion of some ongoing work that we are doing to really try to think about how we can use insights from psychology so that we can improve our game models and, in particular, have more realistic models of attackers that we can try to optimize our behavior against. Okay? So we're trying to look at games in the context of cybersecurity. Another interesting thing about what we are currently trying to do is that we are trying to make these behavioral models more fine-grained. And what I mean by that is there's been a lot of work in behavioral game theory where we are just trying to model any generic human, right? A human. How can we come up with a way to predict the behavior of a human? Well, there's a lot of interesting things that we might be able to know or observe about particular humans that might affect how they make decisions. They might affect their goals and motivations. They also might affect the details of how they make specific kinds of choices. And we would like to be able to come up with behavioral models that are more fine-grained than often you see in behavioral game theory. So here's the 30,000-foot view of our research process. So we're interested first in identifying hypotheses about behavior, okay? And that's what people who've researched humans for a long time are very good at, and where we are really drawing on collaborations with people in psychology and related areas to try to figure out, well, what kind of useful hypotheses might we have, right? So then we want to take those and see whether we can actually make useful predictions based on those in scenarios related to cybersecurity decisions. So we have to come up with some scenarios. Now, initially, we're going to be targeting laboratory experiments, so these scenarios have to be somewhat simplified, perhaps, from the real world, so that we can gather laboratory data. So once we've designed some scenarios, then we want to be able to actually implement game-theoretic algorithms that will make use of that information. So there's a whole part of the research which is about developing new solution concepts and developing algorithms to exploit that information in our game-theoretic analysis. And then, of course, testing it out in the laboratory, and ultimately, if things are promising in the laboratory setting, taking it and trying to take it further into the field, either analyzing existing data that we can collect or running more fielded experiments. Of course, this process may iterate many times, and it takes quite a bit of effort to get to this final stage, but that's the ultimate goal. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here of projects that we're currently working on. So this is Dan Jones. He's a faculty member in psychology at UTEP. And his primary area of research is the dark triad, as they call it. I think somebody else said dark tetrad earlier. So what they think about is these different personality types, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. So he would do a much better job of describing all of the details of what these are and what kind of predictions we can make than I will, but I'm going to try to at least give the basics of what he might say. So he would say that narcissists represent these very self-centered, grandiose exaggerators. Perhaps they are a bit overconfident in their approach. Psychopathy is more associated with people who are perhaps reckless deceivers, who may be more aggressive, who don't necessarily think things through as much as others might, whereas Machiavellians are the more strategic manipulators. He likes to say that they're actually probably the closest to what we're thinking about in our normal game models of the very rational, very precise decision makers who are carefully balancing risk and reward and also demonstrate a significant degree of flexibility. And they thought a little bit about when each of these different types might be likely to engage in cybercrime, what their motivations might be. So Machiavellians would be focused on the real gain, perhaps a financial gain, something that can easily be measured. Psychopathy might be more associated with, first of all, they'd be interested in the gain, but there might also be a more fun component, right? So, for example, to take a very small scale type of misbehavior on the internet, we've all encountered trolls online, right? So they're not really major security concerns, but they're certainly annoying. And a Machiavellian might be less likely to engage in that kind of behavior, whereas a psychopath might just want to see somebody else get really angry and have fun doing it. Narcissism, that's going to be more associated with ego-driven activities, demonstrating how amazing and smart you are compared to others. So a couple of examples of possible behavioral hypotheses that we're looking to be able to exploit in our game-theoretic analysis is things like differences in attention to risk and reward. So are you somebody who attends carefully to both the upside and the downsides and weighs the likelihood of different outcomes and is able to do that looking far out into the future? or somebody who may be just looking at the rewards and discounting possible risks or discounting possible costs of actions. Part of this may also have to do with patience. Are you looking for a quick big score, or are you really about the long game and trying to extract as much value as possible over potentially a very long-term planning horizon? Another very interesting thing that we think might vary among different types of individuals is their rate and ability to adapt to the other player. So in game theory, if we were assuming perfect rational opponents, the assumption is that they have thought through all of these levels of, if I do this, then you're going to do that, then I'm going to do this, then you're going to do that, out to infinity, essentially. So we're assuming that they're really taking into account what we're doing and adapting their behavior to it. In practice, when we run experiments, we don't always see that level of adaptation. So the question is, are there useful differences that we can identify in how much and how quickly people might adapt to our defender strategies? Okay. So those are the types of predictions that we can make use of in designing game-theoretic solutions. So here is a test bed that some of my students have been developing. This is not finished and in final form yet, but it gives you an idea of the kind of thing that we're looking at. So the first test bed is based on a version of the Flip It game. So some of you may be familiar with Flip It. The original version of the Flip It game is designed to model stealthy takeover. So the idea is that there's a defender and an attacker who are competing over some resource, and the defender gets to flip it back into an uncompromised state, while the attacker gets to flip it back into a compromised state, perhaps with some cost to their actions. However, they do not directly observe when the other player takes control, right? So this is intended to model a variety of kinds of situations. We talked about passwords earlier and why you might want to have a policy that for resetting passwords. Well, this is the kind of reason why. You may not know when your password has been lost, right? And resetting your password, even if it has been lost, allows you to flip back into an uncompromised state. There's also other interpretations of this in terms of advanced persistent threats and reimaging machines and those kinds of things. The point is that there's some interesting strategic choices going on here, and we'd like to be able to incorporate these kind of human behavior models to see if we can do better against human attackers in these sort of laboratory experiments than the perfect game-theoretic solutions, which is what people have largely looked at to date in these kinds of games. And exactly these kinds of trade-offs of how much do you tend to the value of a particular resource versus the cost of attacking that resource are the kinds of things that come up in this game and that we will be able to manipulate experimentally. A second example where we're looking at a different kind of human behavior modeling is trying to think more about the learning that humans might do in these kinds of games and repeated interactions. And here we're also collaborating with a team from Carnegie Mellon University led by Cody Gonzalez. And they've been doing work on instance-based learning theory, which, as I understand it, is incorporated and being worked on in the context of ACT-R, which is one of these very comprehensive cognitive models that's intended to model the entirety of human cognition, ultimately. So they have a very particular model of how people learn from experience. And to be frank, I haven't incorporated all the details of that myself. They're really the experts on that. But they validated this in different kinds of choice models, including some simple games, including they've done experiments with the prisoner's dilemma and how people learn in prisoner's dilemma, and also recently some examples of security games in collaboration with Lind and his group. So here the essential question is related to this adaptation question. First of all, so if we are playing the defender strategy and we're playing against the attackers, will they, over time, learn what we're doing? Will they be able to adapt and optimize their response to a defender policy? How quickly will they do that? And then finally, the most interesting question is, well, if they are learning, what can we do to mitigate that? What can we do to actually make it harder for them to learn? And this is, I think, a very interesting question in general in cybersecurity, because one of the things that we would like to be able to do is to make it difficult for attackers to learn about the characteristics of our systems that allow them to figure out what kinds of attacks might be successful, right? One of the initial phases in any attack is going to be reconnaissance, right? So this is one way that you might be able to think about making that phase of an attack more difficult. Okay. And here we're actually looking at test beds based on variations of the honeypot selection games, where we're allowing the defender to introduce honeypots. And we're looking at how well attackers might be able to learn what our honeypot deployment strategy is in these kinds of games. All right, so just to wrap up with a few highlights of the points that I wanted to make here. So first of all, the whole research agenda that we've been exploring is thinking about how we can use game theory as a foundation for thinking about these kinds of decision problems in security, including both physical infrastructure protection and cybersecurity. It seems like they are a useful way to model a lot of different kinds of decisions, although the models are obviously imperfect and can be improved in a lot of ways, as can our means of analyzing these models and trying to come up with better decisions, especially when there are humans involved. So I mentioned deploying honeypots. I also wanted to mention a couple of other game theory models that we've developed for cybersecurity problems just very briefly. One is on the problem of email filtering, so specifically trying to target things like spear phishing attacks. And you may have an automated system that's looking at your email and trying to decide whether or not it is suspicious or not, right? This is one of the first lines of defense we have. And all of those systems have knobs in them, essentially. They're usually based on some variation of machine learning. And you have to make a choice as to how much do you value false positives versus false negatives, right? How damaging is it if something malicious gets through that you didn't detect versus how bad is it if the system detects something as malicious that in fact was not. And of course, we'd all like to make them as accurate as possible, and that's great. But there's actually more to it than that. There's also a question of perhaps where do you set the threshold? And should you set that the same for all users, or perhaps should you try to personalize that? So we've started thinking about some of those kinds of decisions, again, using game-theoretic models. Another recent one is thinking about the allocation of security experts to investigate alerts. So this is one of the key resource limitations in a lot of cybersecurity environments is the human experts, right? You may get tens of thousands of alerts, and you may have only a few people available to be able to investigate them. So how do we prioritize that, and how do we think about that decision process? A lot of the work in game theory does rely on equilibrium models, which I will argue are a useful starting point. They are well understood, and the other nice property that they do have is that they often reflect a worst case assumption of an attacker or an opponent who is as intelligent or as strong as possible. However, they do make a large number of unrealistic assumptions, particularly about human behavior. And we've already demonstrated in some contexts that you can improve these models using information and insights about human behavior. But there's a lot of work remaining to be done thinking about more comprehensive predictive models of behavior and how we can best make use of those in the context of decision making, right? So we want to take everything that we understand about what the humans are doing, what their goals are, what their decision-making processes, but now we want to take that and actually use it to improve some real decision that we care about. And that, for us, is the ultimate thing that we are trying to achieve. So thank you very much, and I can move to questions at this time.